If you agree that heroes deserve to be remembered, make sure to like and subscribe. It wasn't a soldier in that bed, just another old man who'd spent more time in the waiting room than anyone cared to notice. He was as invisible as the years that passed in the sterile hospital ward. His name was Sergeant Daniel Hayes, but no one called him that. They didn't need to. To them, he was just a relic, a faded uniform of a man whose time had passed. The nurses saw him as another patient on a long list, the ones who didn't have visitors and whose memories seemed to evaporate with each passing day. But there was something different about Daniel, something that even the most dismissive eyes couldn't fully understand. He didn't talk much, just sat quietly in his bed, staring at the shadow box on the wall across from him. The medals inside had long been forgotten, even by him. They were from another lifetime, from another world where he wasn't invisible, where his name had meant something. Back then, he had been someone, a leader, a hero. But that was all a long time ago. Now, it was just another faded memory of a young man who once fought for something bigger than himself. The nurses didn't know his story. How could they? They didn't know about the night he crawled through enemy lines to rescue a wounded comrade, where the time his platoon was ambushed, and he had ordered them to hold their ground until reinforcements came. They didn't know about the lives he saved, the men who owed him their lives, or the ones who didn't make it back. They only knew him as the old man who stared at that shadow box every day. Some days, they would shake their heads at the empty walls, gossiping about the unfortunate cases they'd been assigned to. But that wasn't the real story of Sergeant Daniel Hayes. His story had been locked away in that shadow box for decades. A letter inside, sealed with care, was the key. A letter from a general, signed with respect, that spoke of acts of bravery, valor, and service far beyond the average soldier's call. Those medals weren't just trinkets. They were the symbols of a man who had earned them on the front lines, who had faced death with unflinching courage. But none of that mattered to the people who surrounded him now. They couldn't see it. It wasn't until the day he didn't wake up that the box was opened. The staff had gone about their usual rounds. The machines beeped with the regularity of routine, and no one gave much thought to the old man in the bed. When they found him, his eyes closed, his breath still, they simply moved to prepare the room for someone else. That's when they noticed the box. It wasn't the first time they had seen it, but it was the first time they really looked at it. Curious, perhaps, from the quiet hum of the hospital. It was odd. The box had been there for years, but never once had anyone bothered to ask about it. When they opened it, they found medals no one in that building had ever seen before. They were the kind of medals reserved for extraordinary acts, medals that spoke of battles fought in far-off lands. And the letter, never before read, never before acknowledged, told a story that the hospital staff could never have imagined. The letter, signed by a general, told of a soldier who had not only fought, but had led a mission so daring, so life-altering, that it was classified and never mentioned again. A mission that, in some circles, had earned Sergeant Daniel Hayes a reputation as a hero whose name had faded into obscurity. The staff didn't know what to make of it at first. There was no way to connect this old man lying still in a bed to the decorated soldier the letter described. But the truth was undeniable. And as they pieced together the fragments of his past, some from the letter, some from whispered stories shared among the older veterans who occasionally visited the hospital, the truth began to sink in. This man, whose name was barely remembered, had once been a leader of men. He had once been a warrior, but it was too late for anyone to truly see him. The box was returned to the small shelf by his bed, the medals carefully placed inside, and the letter folded and stored away. But it was no longer just another piece of forgotten history. It was a legacy, a story that deserved to be told, a life that deserved to be remembered. Sergeant Daniel Hayes had never asked for recognition. He never expected it. But in the end, the truth of who he was, who he had been, was too powerful to stay hidden forever. And for the first time in years, someone remembered. They remembered a man who had stood at the front and led when others faltered. They remembered the soldier who had faced impossible odds and survived, only to fade into the background when the world moved on. But his legacy, like the medals in the box, had always been there, waiting to be recognized, waiting to be remembered. Some stories take time to surface, to find the right moment to be told. But when they do, they have the power to change everything. Sergeant Daniel Hayes was more than just an old man in a hospital bed. He was a soldier whose story had been waiting to be told. And now, it was finally time for the world to listen. The staff at the hospital had always treated Sergeant Daniel Hayes as an old man who had long outlived his usefulness to the world. But with the discovery of the medals and that forgotten letter, everything changed. The news spread quickly through the hospital, carried from one room to the next, one staff member to another, like a whispered secret that couldn't be ignored. It was like they'd all missed the truth about the man who had spent years in their care, too quiet, too humble to ever boast about his past. At first, the reactions were mixed. Some were indifferent, unable to comprehend how a man in his condition could have once been a decorated hero. Others, especially the older staff members who had served in their own military days, felt a quiet reverence grow. They began to take notice of the small details they had missed before. The creases in his uniform that no longer fit quite right. The subtle but unmistakable air of a man who had seen far more than he let on. Lena, the young nurse who had cared for him in his final days, was one of the first to take the discovery seriously. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story than anyone realized. Her curiosity drove her to search through old records and archives, seeking any trace of the soldier behind the faded uniform. And one day, in a dusty corner of the hospital's library, she found it. The general's letter, written in crisp, elegant handwriting, spoke of Daniel's bravery during a covert mission that had taken place nearly 50 years ago. It wasn't just a mission to cross enemy lines or recover stolen intel. It was a mission that had saved countless lives, that had stopped an entire operation from going south, one that had been classified for decades. The general spoke of Daniel's leadership, his unshakable resolve under fire, his uncanny ability to make life and death decisions in an instant. But the most powerful part of the letter was its final line. "He is one of the finest soldiers I have ever known, the true heart of this unit. May his courage never be forgotten." Lena sat there for hours, reading and rereading those words. She couldn't fathom how a man who had done so much could be relegated to the background of so many people's lives. His medals were stashed in a box, his story buried under years of hospital appointments and quiet evenings alone. It wasn't right. It wasn't fair. Determined to do something, Lena reached out to a few veterans organizations, trying to piece together more of Daniel's past. As the days went by, more stories began to surface. Bits and pieces of the soldier that had once been, the man who had led others through hell and emerged unscathed, only to be forgotten by a world that had moved on. But every new detail seemed to only deepen the mystery of why he had chosen silence, why he had accepted the life he led now. Through one of her calls, Lena got in touch with a retired captain, now living in a quiet town miles away from the hospital. His voice crackled on the phone, but when Lena mentioned Daniel's name, it was like a spark had been lit. "Daniel Hayes? That man saved my life," the captain said, his voice softening. "I owe him everything." The captain spoke of the battle where Daniel had led his men through an enemy ambush, using nothing but instinct and years of combat experience to guide them to safety. He spoke of Daniel's calm in the face of chaos, how his decisions had kept them alive when every other option seemed impossible. "You wouldn't know it to look at him now," the captain continued, "but that man could have commanded armies. He still could, if he ever decided to raise his voice." Lena listened, the pieces falling into place. She realized Daniel had never wanted recognition. He had never craved the accolades that came with leadership. He had served for the men around him, for the mission, for the honor. And now, when he had nothing left but memories, it was too late for anyone to understand. But Lena wasn't ready to let that be the end of his story. As she dug deeper into the records, she found more: letters, journals, testimonials from fellow soldiers, each one painting a picture of a man who had given everything without asking for anything in return. The pieces of Daniel Hayes' life were scattered, lost in time, but they were there, waiting to be found. Lena knew what she had to do next. She approached the hospital administration with an idea: to host a small ceremony to honor Daniel's service. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She wanted the veterans who still came to the hospital, the ones who had been through their own wars, to witness what they had missed. She wanted the staff, who had passed him by every day without understanding, to see him for who he had truly been. But when she proposed the idea, she was met with resistance. "Why bother?" one of the senior nurses asked. "He was just a soldier. No one remembers those guys. Lena didn't back down. He deserves to be remembered. Every soldier does. The weeks following were filled with frustration, paperwork, and a mounting sense of urgency. Finally, the day came when the ceremony was set. Lena had managed to gather a few veterans, some of whom had served with Daniel, others who had only heard whispers of his heroism. The small hospital chapel was filled with the quiet murmur of people trying to make sense of what they had all missed. When it came time for the ceremony, Lena stood before the small crowd, holding a framed picture of Daniel from his younger days, standing proud in his military uniform. The picture, with its sharp contrasts and faded edges, was the face of a man who had once commanded respect. And yet, the real hero wasn't the face in the photo. It was the story behind it. It was the silent strength that no one had ever truly appreciated. The ceremony wasn't grand. It wasn't televised. But it was enough. It was the moment when Daniel Hayes was no longer forgotten. The moment when the world remembered that heroes don't fade. They endure, in memories and in the hearts of those who know the true cost of freedom. As Lena stood at the podium, looking out at the men and women who had gathered in that small chapel, she realized one thing. Even the quietest lives can hold the loudest echoes. And sometimes, the most important stories are the ones that go untold, until someone makes sure they never fade. The ceremony was over, but the ripples of Sergeant Daniel Hayes' legacy had only just begun to spread. Lena had hoped that the small gathering in the chapel would be enough to give Daniel the recognition he deserved, but what happened afterward far exceeded her expectations. The moment the last person left the room, Daniel's story began to take on a life of its own. It was as though his quiet legacy had been dormant, waiting for the right person to bring it back to life. And when Lena did, it took hold of everyone who had ever crossed paths with him, even if they had never known his name before. Word spread, slowly at first, as it always did in tight-knit communities. But then, as though carried by an invisible current, it reached further. The veterans organizations Lena had contacted, some of them located far across the country, began to investigate the forgotten soldier. Articles started popping up in military journals and small local papers. The quiet nurse who had taken the time to uncover Daniel's past was now becoming the person people went to for answers about the man who had been lost to time. Her phone began to ring more frequently, and she found herself talking to those who had served with him, remembering stories she never thought she'd hear. Among them was a retired colonel, one of Daniel's commanding officers, who called one evening to speak with Lena. His voice carried the gravitas of someone who had spent decades leading men. "Lena, what you've done for Daniel, it's more than anyone ever did for him in all his years. He always told me he didn't want the attention. I think that's why he disappeared for so long. But you've given him a place, a memory. And that, my dear, is worth more than any medal." Lena was taken aback by the weight of his words. She never thought of it that way. She had only wanted to give him a small measure of justice before it was too late. But, hearing him speak, she understood. What she had done wasn't just about medals and recognition. It was about honor, the kind of honor that never fades, no matter how many years pass. It was about ensuring that those who serve, who sacrifice, are never left in silence. And, in Daniel's case, that silence had lasted far too long. The more Lena learned, the more she began to realize how deeply Daniel's absence had affected not just those who knew him, but the very fabric of the community he had served. They had all been complicit in the forgetting. And now, it was up to them to ensure it didn't happen again. But it wasn't just the old veterans who remembered Daniel now. Young men and women in uniform, new soldiers, fresh out of boot camp, had started to hear his name whispered among them, their curiosity piqued by the stories they had heard. And one by one, they came to visit the hospital, some even making it a point to stand at Daniel's old bed, imagining the soldier who had once held it. A few even left small notes of gratitude, placed beside his shadow box, as if to continue what Lena had started, a living memorial, a thread that connected the past with the present. The hospital, too, changed. The staff began to understand more than just the basics of care. They began to understand the weight of the veterans they looked after, the quiet strength behind every weathered face, the battles fought not just in foreign lands, but in the silence they carried with them. The hospital started honoring veterans, with a corner dedicated to those like Daniel, who had been neglected by time, but whose stories still had the power to change lives. And it wasn't just the staff, it was the community, too. They began to reach out, too, sending letters, flowers, or stopping by for a quiet moment in front of the shadow box. It was as though Daniel's story had taken root, growing stronger each day. For Lena, it had become more than just a project. It became a calling. She organized events, invited families, and, more importantly, kept telling Daniel's story. Every year, on the anniversary of the day his medals were discovered, she would hold a small ceremony, a private moment for the veterans who wanted to pay tribute to the man who had never asked for a thing, but had given everything. The ceremony was never grand, just a small group of those who had known him in the days of his service, and those who had only just discovered his name. One of the last things Lena did was compile all the letters, photographs, and stories she had gathered into a book. She called it The Silent Soldier's Legacy. It wasn't a book that would sell thousands of copies, but it was the kind of book that mattered to those who needed it. It was a tribute to the forgotten ones, those who walked among us unnoticed, but who had lived lives filled with more courage than anyone could ever imagine. And as Lena finished the final chapter, she paused, her fingers tracing the image of Daniel in his prime, standing proud with his unit. It had taken so long for his story to reach the world, but now, it would live on forever. Not just in the book, but in the hearts of those who had come to know him through her work. As the sun set on the quiet town, Lena closed the book and placed it on the shelf next to the shadow box. A reminder that the stories we forget have a way of finding their way back. Daniel Hayes, the soldier who had been forgotten, was now remembered, not by medals, but by the people whose lives had been touched by his sacrifice.